The full episode of Gloves Off didn't just begin. It erupted with a kind of raw, uncontrollable intensity that immediately made it clear this was not going to be another routine boxing promo, because the moment Benavidez and Gilberto Ramírez were brought together in that unfiltered environment, the atmosphere shifted into something far more serious, far more unpredictable, almost like the cameras had accidentally captured a moment that was never meant to be fully seen by the public, and from the very first second there was a tension so thick it felt suffocating, as if both fighters walked in carrying not just confidence but a storm of unspoken emotions. Pride, pressure, legacy, and a silent but dangerous determination to prove dominance at any cost, and what made it even more shocking was how little needed to be said for that energy to explode, because every stare lingered just a second too long, every pause felt loaded with meaning, and every subtle movement hinted that this wasn't just about promoting a fight anymore but about something deeply personal that had been building beneath the surface for far too long, creating a psychological battlefield where neither man was willing to give even an inch, and as audiences across the USA and UK tuned in expecting the usual scripted back and forth, they instead found themselves witnessing what felt like the early stages of a silent war unfolding in real time, where respect was hanging by a thread and the line between controlled professionalism and pure confrontation looked like it could snap at any moment, making the entire situation feel unpredictable, slightly dangerous, and undeniably gripping in a way that left viewers questioning whether what they were watching was still just promotion or the beginning of something far more explosive. As the opening visuals of Gloves Off rolled, the production didn't just highlight past moments. It deliberately constructed a chilling contrast that became impossible to ignore, almost as if it was quietly warning viewers about the collision that was coming, presenting David Benavidez as a relentless, suffocating force of nature, a fighter who doesn't just apply pressure but weaponizes it, dragging opponents into deep, chaotic waters where panic begins to replace strategy, overwhelming them with a storm of punches, pace, and presence that feels nearly impossible to escape, while on the other side, Gilberto Ramírez was portrayed as something far more calculated and almost eerily calm. A composed technician who doesn't chase chaos but controls it, someone who studies every movement with cold precision, slows the fight down to his rhythm, and waits patiently for the exact moment to strike with accuracy that can dismantle even the most aggressive opponents. And what made this presentation so shocking wasn't just the contrast itself, but how intensely it was emphasized, making it clear that this wasn't shaping up to be a typical clash of strength or endurance, but something far deeper and far more dangerous. A battle between two completely opposite philosophies of boxing, where one thrives in destruction and disorder while the other depends on control and calculation, creating a scenario where only one approach can survive when they finally meet in the ring. And as the visuals intensified, it began to feel less like a preview and more like a warning, leaving viewers with the unsettling realization that when these two worlds collide, it won't just determine a winner, it could expose a breaking point in one of them, turning the fight into something far more explosive, unpredictable, and potentially career-defining than anyone initially expected. When the cameras finally settled into the sit-down setting, the silence between them didn't just linger. It took control of the entire room in a way that felt almost unsettling, turning what should have been a simple pause into one of the most powerful and intimidating moments of the entire episode. Because this wasn't empty silence, it was loaded with intent, calculation, and an unspoken challenge, as David Benavidez and Gilberto Ramírez locked into a quiet but intense exchange that felt more like the opening round of a fight than a promotional conversation, with both men carefully studying each other down to the smallest detail, every shift in posture, every flicker of expression, every controlled breath. Analyzing weaknesses, reading confidence, and testing mental strength without saying a single word, and what made it even more shocking was how naturally this tension took over, as if the fight had already begun long before they ever stepped into the ring, creating a psychological battlefield where neither fighter was willing to break first, and as the seconds stretched, that silence became heavier, sharper, and more uncomfortable, setting a tone that made everything that followed feel significantly more serious, more personal, and far more real than any scripted back and forth could ever achieve, leaving viewers with the undeniable feeling that they weren't just watching an interview anymore, they were witnessing the calm before something explosive, where respect was fading, pressure was building, and one wrong word or reaction could have instantly ignited a confrontation that felt dangerously close to the surface. The very first question about respect might have sounded simple, almost routine on the surface, but the moment it was answered, it quietly cracked open the tension that had been building beneath the silence, because when David Benavidez responded, it wasn't just confidence. It was calculated, controlled, and deliberately sharp, as he acknowledged Gilberto Ramírez as a skilled and experienced opponent, but then subtly shifted the narrative by making it clear that, in his view, Ramírez had never experienced the kind of suffocating, relentless pressure he himself brings into the ring, and that single statement landed heavier than it initially sounded, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't disrespectful in an obvious way, but it carried a quiet warning that instantly changed the atmosphere, almost like a line had been drawn without either fighter needing to raise their voice, and what made it even more intense was how precise it felt. Just enough to challenge, just enough to provoke, but controlled enough to avoid turning into an outright confrontation, creating a moment where the tension didn't explode but instead tightened, becoming sharper and more focused, signaling to everyone watching that this wasn't going to be a friendly exchange filled with mutual praise, but the beginning of a psychological battle where every word would be measured, every response would carry weight, and even the smallest comment could escalate into something far more serious as both fighters edged closer to revealing what they truly thought of each other. Ramírez's response didn't rise to the bait. Instead, it cooled the room in a way that somehow made everything feel even more intense, because when Gilberto Ramírez finally spoke, his tone was calm, controlled, and almost unsettlingly precise, creating a powerful contrast to the pressure-heavy narrative being built around David Benavidez, and rather than reacting emotionally or trying to match the underlying challenge with aggression, he chose his words with surgical care, explaining that pressure only matters if it's effective, and that throughout his career he has faced a wide range of styles, adapting, adjusting, and overcoming each one without losing composure, and that statement, while subtle, carried a deeper implication that landed harder than any direct insult could have. That Benavidez's greatest weapon might not be as overwhelming as people believe, and what made it even more shocking was how effortlessly he delivered it, without raising his voice, without breaking eye contact, almost as if he was completely unfazed by the threat in front of him, which added a new layer of psychological tension to the exchange, because now it wasn't just about pressure versus technique, it was about belief versus doubt, control versus chaos, and as his quiet confidence settled into the room, it didn't ease the atmosphere, it tightened it, making the conversation more gripping, more uncomfortable, and far more dangerous, as both fighters continued to circle each other verbally, knowing that every calm response and every subtle remark was slowly building toward something that could erupt at any moment. As the discussion pushed deeper into mindset, the tension didn't ease. It sharpened, because David Benavidez fully leaned into his identity as a relentless enforcer inside the ring, describing with unwavering confidence how he doesn't just fight opponents but systematically breaks them down over time, using an exhausting pace and suffocating pressure to drag them into uncomfortable territory where doubt begins to creep in and stamina starts to fade, forcing them into mistakes they can't recover from, and the way he explained it made it sound less like a strategy and more like an inevitable outcome, as if once a fighter is caught in his rhythm, escape simply isn't an option. But what made the moment even more intense was how Gilberto Ramírez responded, because instead of challenging that idea head-on, he introduced a completely different and almost opposing philosophy, calmly emphasizing discipline, patience, and control, making it clear that for him, a fight isn't about being dragged into chaos but about dictating every second of it, controlling distance, timing, and tempo so precisely that the opponent is forced to fight on his terms, and that contrast didn't just highlight two styles. It exposed two completely different mental worlds colliding, one built on pressure and inevitability, the other on composure and control, and as both fighters doubled down on their beliefs, it created a narrative that felt increasingly unpredictable and quietly dangerous, because it became impossible to ignore the reality that when these two ideologies finally clash in the ring, one of them won't just lose. It could be completely broken, turning what initially seemed like a stylistic matchup into something far more explosive, where the outcome wouldn't just decide a winner, but potentially redefine whose approach to fighting truly survives under the highest level of pressure. The producers then shifted the focus toward preparation, but instead of simply showing routine training clips, they crafted a behind-the-scenes sequence that felt almost revealing. Like fans were being allowed to see the hidden machinery behind two completely different fighting systems being built for collision, and once again the contrast was impossible to ignore, as David Benavidez was shown pushing himself through brutal, high-intensity workouts that looked less like training and more like controlled punishment, constantly moving, constantly throwing, building an engine designed to never slow down, reinforcing his identity as a fighter who overwhelms, suffocates, and refuses to give opponents a moment to breathe, while on the other side, Gilberto Ramírez approached preparation with a completely different energy, calm, focused, almost surgical, working on precision, timing, footwork, and subtle movement, fine-tuning every detail with the patience of someone who believes that one perfectly timed action can neutralize an entire storm of aggression. And what made this contrast so powerful, and honestly a bit unsettling, was how clearly it reinforced the reality that this isn't just a physical contest, it's a calculated clash of philosophies, where one man is preparing to break his opponent through relentless force, while the other is preparing to dismantle that force piece by piece, creating a situation that feels increasingly unpredictable, because when two fighters train for completely opposite outcomes with such conviction, it raises a dangerous question that lingers in the background. Which approach survives when there's no more room for adjustment and no second chances once the fight begins? As the episode returned to the sit-down, the shift in energy was impossible to ignore, because what had started as controlled tension had now evolved into something sharper, more direct, and far more revealing, with both Benavidez and Gilberto Ramírez speaking with a level of confidence that no longer felt measured. It felt intentional, almost like each response was now part of a calculated attempt to gain psychological ground, and when the conversation turned to weaknesses, the moment carried a different kind of weight, because neither fighter gave a clear or straightforward answer, yet somehow that silence spoke louder than any admission could have, as their tone, their expressions, and the way they chose to deflect revealed something deeper. That both men were fully aware of exactly what they were up against, fully aware of the risks, and fully prepared to face them head-on without giving anything away. And what made it even more intense was how this refusal to expose vulnerability didn't create distance between them, it pulled them closer into a mental standoff where respect and rivalry began to blur, building a sense that this was no longer just about strategy or preparation, but about who was willing to hold their ground under pressure the longest, turning the exchange into something far more gripping and slightly dangerous, where every word felt deliberate, every pause carried meaning, and the atmosphere continued to tighten as if both fighters were inching closer to a moment where control could slip and the calm surface could finally crack into something far more explosive. The conversation then shifted toward legacy, and that's where everything became heavier, more personal, and impossible to ignore, because the tone didn't just change. It deepened, revealing what was truly at stake beneath all the composure and controlled exchanges, as Benavidez made it clear that this fight isn't just another step in his career but a defining moment where he intends to prove, without any doubt, that he belongs at the absolute highest level of the sport, not just as a contender but as a dominant force capable of overwhelming anyone placed in front of him, speaking with a confidence that felt less like belief and more like certainty. While Gilberto Ramírez approached the same topic from a completely different emotional angle, calm but deeply driven, framing the fight as an opportunity to silence every critic who has ever questioned his place among boxing's elite, to finally erase any doubt surrounding his abilities and cement his name where he believes it has always belonged. And what made this exchange so intense wasn't just the words themselves, but the underlying emotion behind them, because for both fighters this wasn't about hype or promotion anymore, it was about identity, reputation, and legacy, turning the moment into something far more serious than a standard interview, as the tension in the room subtly shifted from competitive to almost personal, creating a powerful sense that when these two finally meet in the ring, they won't just be fighting for victory. They'll be fighting to define who they truly are at the highest level, and that realization added a layer of pressure and unpredictability that made the entire situation feel even more explosive, as if the outcome of this fight could permanently change the trajectory of both of their careers. One of the most intense exchanges came when they were asked the simplest yet most dangerous question: who wins? And instead of playing it safe or hiding behind respectful cliches, both fighters stepped directly into the moment with a level of confidence that instantly raised the temperature in the room, as Benavidez made his prediction with a firm, almost unshakable tone, stating that his relentless pressure wouldn't just challenge Gilberto Ramírez but ultimately break him down over time, painting a picture of a fight where resistance slowly fades under constant attack, while Ramírez, without showing even a hint of discomfort, responded in a completely different but equally powerful way, calmly asserting that patience, timing, and precision would be the keys to exposing openings and turning the fight in his favor. And what made this moment so shocking wasn't just the confidence in their words, but how completely opposite their visions of victory were, creating a visible and almost uncomfortable tension that hung in the air, because neither man backed down, neither softened their stance, and neither showed any doubt, turning what could have been a routine prediction into a quiet but intense standoff where belief clashed directly with belief, leaving viewers with the undeniable sense that this wasn't just talk anymore, it was a preview of two completely different realities preparing to collide, where only one prediction could survive once the first punch is thrown. As the episode progressed, it became clear that this was not just a conversation but a psychological battle, with both fighters using their words, tone, and body language to gain a mental edge, and that added a level of depth that made the episode far more engaging than a typical promo. The discussion then shifted toward fan expectations, particularly in the USA and UK where interest in the fight is growing rapidly, and both fighters acknowledged the pressure but made it clear that their focus remains on performance rather than hype. Another key moment came when the topic of ring control was brought up, with Benavidez insisting that his pressure will dictate the pace, while Ramirez argued that control comes from timing and positioning, and that debate highlighted the core of the matchup. As tension continued to build, even the smallest details such as eye contact and posture became significant, because neither fighter showed any sign of doubt, creating an atmosphere where every moment felt meaningful. The producers then began building toward the face-off, and as both fighters stood up, the energy in the room shifted instantly, becoming quiet and intense. When they finally stood face to face, locking eyes without speaking, the moment carried a level of intensity that didn't need explanation, because everything was communicated through their presence. What made the face-off even more compelling was the control both fighters maintained, with no pushing or shouting, just pure focus. As cameras captured every angle, fans across the USA and UK reacted instantly, with clips going viral and debates starting. As the face-off ended, both fighters returned to their positions without breaking character, maintaining the same level of focus. As the episode moved toward its conclusion, it became clear that this fight is more than just a matchup, it's a clash of styles and mentalities. The final moments reinforced the idea that this rivalry is real and far from resolved. The emotional weight of the fight continued to build as both fighters delivered closing statements. The episode ultimately created a narrative that fans are now deeply invested in. The unpredictability of the matchup remains its most compelling element, because despite everything that has been said, shown, and analyzed, there's still no clear answer to what will actually happen when Benavidez and Gilberto Ramírez finally step into the ring, and that uncertainty doesn't come from a lack of information. It comes from the fact that both fighters represent completely different forces that are equally capable of taking control, with one built on relentless pressure and the ability to break opponents mentally and physically over time, while the other relies on discipline, patience, and precision to slowly dismantle whatever is placed in front of him, creating a rare situation where neither style clearly cancels the other out, but instead threatens to expose it. And what makes it even more intense is the realization that both men genuinely believe their approach is not just effective, but inevitable, turning the fight into something far more than a contest of skill. It becomes a test of whose philosophy can survive under the highest level of resistance, and that lingering uncertainty keeps the tension alive, because no matter how much confidence either side shows, no matter how convincing their arguments sound, the truth is that once the fight begins, everything can change in a single moment, making the entire matchup feel volatile, dangerous, and impossible to predict in a way that keeps fans locked in, knowing that they're not just watching a fight. They're witnessing a clash where anything could happen and everything is on the line. And in the end, what started as a promotional episode transformed into something much bigger, a story of pride, strategy, and identity, leaving fans with one question: when these two finally meet in the ring, which style will prevail, and will we witness a shocking outcome that redefines both of their careers?